afternoon. So I'm going to try to tell you about the brain as an imaginarium. And I thought, who better to tell you what an imaginarium is than Hollywood? So who thinks that's fiction? Fiction, fiction, fiction. Everybody? Who thinks it's not fiction? Two, nobody. Two, not fiction. So I think that should not be so sure. If we look at the ancient philosophers, the ancient Greek philosophers, they thought that we actually project out objects. We map onto the world. They didn't know that light was coming from objects. Of course, today we know that. We know that light is entering the eyes, going through different pathways into the retina and out into the visual part of the brain. And what comes out is this amazing picture. But what we also know is that the brain or the eyes are not just taking little snapshots of the world, sending them into the brain, and then the brain just has to piece them together to make a picture. The brain is not doing that, and the eyes are not doing that. In fact, all your sensory organs are not sending pictures of the outside world into the brain. What they are doing is they're sending clues. They're sending fragments. They're sending features, light, dark, lines, shapes. No explicit pictures are being sent into the brain. The brain takes these clues and constructs a world. So, here is an example. We have limitations in how the brain can do this. Those two bars are actually going at the same speed, but you thought that they were jumping and going at a different speed. Here, if you focus on the X and move your head backwards and forwards, what happens? Too late. Here the bars are moving. They feel like they're moving, but have a look at the lines. They're actually not moving. It's just the shades. And here, this circle, it looks like it's jumping into position, but it's actually a smooth rotation. And even if you know that it's a smooth rotation, you can't stop it from doing that. Look at the X in the middle. What do you see? Green. There's no green there. Which one is bigger in this particular example? Is there a bigger picture? Exactly the same. For who is it turning clockwise? Hands, clockwise. A few. Anti-clockwise. Many more. So half of you see it one way, the other half of you see it another way. There are many, there are dozens and dozens of examples like this, where we have limitations. It's not moving forward. Okay. So have a look at this picture. We grow up in a certain environment. We learn to see the world. That would not be a good strategy or deficit for a monkey, an orangutan hanging upside down. If he wouldn't be able to detect those features, he really would be in trouble. But we don't need that capability. We have to make sense. We learn to make sense of the world. And you're compelled to make sense of those dots. They're just dots. But your brain will make sense of them, and you actually have no choice but to make sense of them. So, this capability of the brain is actually allowing an amazing technology, which is that you can actually implant an artificial retina, a little electrode, inside the eye for blind people, which allows a little camera to capture pictures, but it stimulates, and it just is like a noisy stimulation on the back of the eye to send some information into the brain, but no pictures. This statistical information, this electrical stimulation of the neurons in the retina is what helps that person to see. But when they put the artificial retina in the very first time, then you see that picture on your left. And it takes days, weeks, sometimes months before you begin to see that other picture. Nothing changed. The retina, the artificial retina was the same, your eye was the same, but your brain started to learn to see that picture. And what is actually happening is that in the brain, we not only, of course we get light that has to come into the eye, but we have to iterate with our image that we are creating, and back and forth until we lock into place. We have to lock in on the objects outside. Now, this is not just for vision. This is a person who's deaf, and they've just put in a cochlear implant, an artificial implant, which just produces stimulation. And you see, she can't hear. She doesn't hear what's happening. They've put this in and they've increased it. Still not. She doesn't hear. She can't hear it. So she's been deaf for some time. They put in this implant. She still doesn't hear it. The brain is trying to lock into this noisy information coming from the ears. So they... And suddenly the brain is locked in. It's not because of the implant. The information, the brain suddenly locked in and managed to create the perception of the sound. So it wasn't the ears. Now you may ask whether the brain is really powerful enough to imagine the world. This is Stephen Wiltshire. He was taken up in a helicopter, flown over Rome. Single flight over the city of Rome. And at the end of this, he was given 3 days to draw Rome. He started from memory. He just flew once from memory, and he started to draw the city of Rome. So he wasn't allowed to go back, and over 3 days he has to remember all of the different buildings with windows, lampposts, an exquisite level of detail. And then they did a lot of experiments and checked to see how well he actually remembered. This is the Colosseum, and they overlay a picture of his drawing. The entire city of Rome. Now, Einstein did more than visualize or imagine Rome, he imagined the universe. But not only did he imagine the universe as objects, he imagined it as energy. And because he could imagine it as energy, he could simulate, he could fly on a light beam and imagine how the light beam would be bent by gravity. So it's not only about imagining the objects, but it's actually imagining how they're going to move And that means that the brain has to be able to embody the physics. But how does the brain do it? We've been studying the brain for about 200 years in great detail. We know a lot about the brain. We know about the fibers and the brain regions and how it's constructed, and we even know how the neurons work. We know about the proteins and the genes, but we still don't know how it creates this world. How does it create a perception? So about 20 years ago, I decided that the only way that we're probably going to get to understanding how the brain is doing this is to build it. To build the brain from the bottom, to build the Imaginarium. So how would you go about that? This is a huge challenge, because the brain, it took the universe about 4 billion years to build the brain. In fact, that's on Earth, but if you take the whole universe, you heard the lecture earlier, 13.7 billion years. So if it took the universe 13.7 billion years to build the brain, how would it be possible to build it within our lifetime? How would you do it? So you have to decide where to start. And the brain, so the key to it is to try to understand what's the most essential part of the brain. The mouse brain evolved from the mouse to the man about 1,000-fold in an expansion, because evolution gifted mammals with a special design of the circuitry, which gave this very almost frightening structure. And the secret to this design is what is called the neocortical columns. It's like a microprocessor. Your brain is made of about 1 million of them. And in evolution, they were so successful, they were just added more and more into the brain until the brain became so convoluted and became wrapped up in on itself. So the secret to the mammalian brain is to understand this neocortical column. It's the holy grail. Can we go in there and extract and derive the blueprint of the neocortical column? So what we had to do was to design experiments that would allow you, this thing is not moving, to design experiments where we actually went, it's like going into the forest, where you draw and you digitize and you record from every single neuron that's there, and you catalog which types they are and how do they communicate and how do they behave. You find out the proteins and the genes that are inside of them and how do they connect with each other. And we did this. This took about 15 years of experimentation to derive all this data until we came out with the blueprint, and that was a few years ago. We derived the blueprint of the neocortical column. So with this, we could start to build it. And here's an example where we take the circuit and start to call up cells. We design, the neocortex has 6 different layers. It has about 10,000 neurons. In your brain, it has about 70,000 neurons. In a rodent brain, about 10,000 neurons. And here's another one. In your brain, it has about 1 kilometer of fibers. You have 1 million of them. That means your brain has about 1 million kilometers of fibers, which is enough to wrap around the Earth a couple of 100 times. Extremely intricate and complicated little structure. And this is the heart of the brain. This is the eye. It's not, your eye is not the eye. This is the eye. And what we can do now is to ask, how does it create these perceptions? So we have to connect them, and to connect them is a major challenge because there are about 10 million points where they connect. And in the experiments, we found that there's very specific rules for where these connections are. If you take that red cell, there are little places. Every place that touches another cell is a place where they can connect. But what we discovered was that the neurons, nature has provided a magical secret which makes the neurons very messy. And by being messy, they all can cover the space of connections of everybody else. And it turns out that they actually map and find the solution of how to connect with each other. By having different structures, like different trees, you can connect in different ways. So and this is the example, and here what you're going to see coming towards you is the 10 million synapses that are connecting this little piece of the brain. Our brain has about 1,000 trillion synapses, and it's interesting, it has the human brain has about 100 billion neurons, similar to the number of galaxies in our universe, as we heard earlier. And what was remarkable when we actually did this is that because the neurons are so messy in terms of the way that they're branching, like trees are in the forest, they will connect in a certain way. And what we found is that the way that they connect is species-specific. That means that actually the one thing that is identical about us, we're all different in every possible way, but the one thing that's different about us is the way that the neurons are connecting. I mean, that's the same. So we're identical in that way, and we think that different species have different ways of connecting, and that allows them potentially to build different worlds. So we have to build it, and we put it on a supercomputer. You have to take every single neuron and map it onto a different processor, so you needed a big supercomputer of about 10,000 processors, and you could get the first glimpse of what that little neocortical column looks like. So this is essentially the area that is receiving the information from the outside world, creating a perception, mapping it back, and iterating with the world in order to be able to see. Just another, don't you think it's the most beautiful thing? I think it's the most beautiful thing that I've ever seen, at least. So, once we have this, what we can do is now trace the steps of how every neuron and every synapse is used to create the world, to build the walls, to map the pictures that are inside a room, the sofa. And while we haven't worked that out completely, we can start looking inside the brain and seeing where the information is being represented or how it's being represented. And what we've seen is that when you throw away the neurons, the branches, and you look at the raw electrical activity, you discover that there is these shapes, which actually is like a little universe inside this tiny piece, which is about the size of a pinhead. And you have these shapes that are representing the information outside. And when the information comes in, they iterate with the information coming in and with the way that they're mapping and building the world to produce these shapes. Now, these shapes are quite messy because we haven't taught it anything. So the way we teach them is to couple them to robots. You have the output going to the robot, you have the input coming to the robot, and as the robot learns, it starts to construct its own meaningful universe. And with this, you can start to understand the way that that universe looks like. So the human brain, of course, is far more complicated. It's going to take us several more years to reach there, but one thing that's for sure is we will reach there. It will be possible to build the human brain and to understand how it is creating these different perceptions or different realities. So one lesson that we've learned from this, of course, the information is coming from the outside, but we do have to interact in order to perceive. And in some way, you could think of the brain as having evolved in order to be able to embody the world. But we also have to learn. So during development, your child is learning how to see. Your child is learning how to embody the physics of the world. Now, the physics of the world, once we've embodied it, we get locked into it, and that's the only way that we can perceive the world. It's very difficult for us to perceive the world in any other way, except in the way that we've learned, because if we didn't learn that way, we'd get run over by a car. But our brain has far more capabilities. As every one of you know, when you go to bed at night and you dream, you go into worlds that have different physics. And so to end off this meeting, this conference, I'd just like to leave you with the view of what could happen with the brain. no limits. Thank you.
Bravo. Wow.